Shall I get started? I will introduce myself first. I'm Maggie Kaplan, and I'm one of the SPEC Elders. And yeah, welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for being here for our learning circle today. I also want to introduce a couple of people without whom we wouldn't be here. One is Carol Christopher, who is kind of the brains behind the SPEC Elders and a lot of SPEC as well, and Ashley Parshin, who is our tech person. And you'll be hearing from both of them at the end of our session. I'll start with the land acknowledgement. And in terms of place, we in SPEC are here on the west coast of so-called Canada, on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And in SPEC, we often do our land acknowledgement by acknowledging a connection we have with nature. But I'm not going to do that today because Riley, our teacher for the day, it tells me her entire talk is a land acknowledgement. Instead, I just want to acknowledge that I, I want to acknowledge the wisdom of the people who have been here for thousands and thousands of years before that land was stolen from them. And how in that time they learned to be the land, they learned to be inseparable from the land. And they're beginning to reclaim that knowledge, not only across Canada, but across all of Turtle Island and all over the world. And I just want to express my appreciation for that. We have a lot to learn, and it's really, really beneficial for all of us, this knowledge. And with that, I want to introduce the teacher of our learning circle today, who is Dr. Riley Olstead. I'm going to have to read this because she's doing a lot. And she is a mother, daughter, sister, and primary human to a puppy named Junebug. She's originally from Coast Salish territory here on the West Coast, but has lived in Mi'kma'ki for almost 20 years now, where she's a professor of sociology at St. Francis Xavier University in what we now call Nova Scotia. Her teaching there and research focuses on climate, decolonization, and ways we learn with the land. And she's presently completing a novel of speculative fiction, along with several collaborative papers, one on frictions in land-based learning, and another on the university in this time of collapse. She has created and taught under the guidance of two Mi'kmaq elders, Dr. Albert Marshall and Kerry Prosper. Dr. Albert Marshall and his wife, Merdina, originally put together the concept of two-eyed seeing for all of us to learn from. And I will just mention that. And what this is, what she has done is a land-based credit university course. This might be so far the only credit university course, but there are other courses of this ilk. And it's a course that deals with two-eyed seeing and bringing an Indigenous way of learning with and as the land into our Western-based colonial mindset. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Riley. Welcome. We're just thrilled to have you here.
Maggie, thank you so much. And it's just lovely to see all of your faces. It's so nice to meet you. I wish we were all in person, but this is just wonderful. And thank you so much for having me. Maybe what I'll start with is to say kwe, hello, from Mi'kma'ki. We call this land the land of the people of the dawn. And as Maggie has mentioned, I live and I teach on these territories. And actually, these lands hold one of the longest histories of colonization on this continent. The violence of this history, it's not only archived in documents, actually you can see it. It's visible in the land itself. And as somebody originally from British Columbia, it's very vivid for me the way that The movement of colonialism beginning here on the Atlantic coast in the early 1600s and moving west with the establishment of the colony of Vancouver Island, I think in 1849. Um, how that gap in time is visible in our forests and our soil, actually. So, to give you a sense of the scale of harm that has and continues to be done here in Mi'kma'ki, it's my understanding that in BC, you continue to have remnants around, I think, 55% of old growth. Whereas here in Nova Scotia, we have less than 1% due to, of course, extensive logging. So, like me, when I got here 20 years ago-ish, others have come here as well and have misunderstood that what they're seeing on the land, they're mistaking the devastation as an aesthetic of the land herself, when in fact what they're seeing are the wounds left by colonialism. Um, so that's one piece of the story of this place. But I also want to point out that alongside this history of harm lives a really extraordinary endurance. These territories are governed by, they're called the Peace and Friendship Treaties, and these affirmed mutual responsibility, and actually determined that the Crown and the Mi'kmaq would share in the abundance of the land. Those agreements have been repeatedly violated, as I'm sure you know. So today, the Mi'kmaq hold only a very small fraction of their unceded lands, something around 0.2%. Of course, which we are now starting to understand is an ongoing injustice with ecological consequences that we're all living with. Um, it's one of my deepest honors to be here with you today and to speak about this course called Climate, Land, and Future. And I like to think of the course as like a tiny little mushroom that emerged from a group that is called the Elder Youth Alliance. And that's where I first met Dr. Carol Christopher, who, of course, is the lead elder of the SPEC Elder group. And maybe I'll just make quick mention that Carol has been really central, um, actually absolutely core to breathing climate, land, and future into being. So this is a big honor to be able to be here with you today, and of course to, as I am talking, to be able to see Carol in the group here. So I'm going to be giving you just a little bit of context. As an educator, I work every day with young people. And what I can tell you is that, and particularly this week with everything that's going on in the world, these young people understand in their bones that they're inheriting uncertain futures. Um, but one of the things I can tell you is that inside the university, almost nobody's actually speaking honestly with them about this. You can even go into like climate and environment programs, and the emphasis really remains on studying for discrete scientific or technical solutions, of course, which reinforces the idea that we humans are somehow going to fix this problem by sciencing our way out of it. So even though we've already crossed multiple planetary tipping points, 7 of 9 actually, and the IPCC continues to issue code red for humanity, the vast majority of the university curriculum, and it's not just here in this university, but across all universities, it's still orienting toward continuity and the assumption that our students are inheriting stable futures. And I can tell you that this is causing a lot of dissonance. So we're seeing significantly increased substance use and a profound increase in apathy, anxiety, depression, and attendance is as poor as I've seen it in my career. And you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that attendance, or excuse me, attention is even worse. So I read these behaviors as some of the ways that these young bodies are responding not only to destabilization, but how we in education are not really acknowledging or preparing students for a world of disruption and cascading change. And again, we can look at what's been going on in the past few weeks as a really good example. The I'm not sure if you're familiar with this group. They're called the Gesturing Toward Decolonial Futures Collective, and they're actually a core resource of the course that I'm going to talk about. And what they say about this kind of silence in our curriculum is that modern education, in fact, reproduces and rewards four denials at the root of our kind of seeming incapacity to talk to our students about this. The first denial actually is about the depth and the magnitude of the trouble that we're facing. And this can actually show up as tendencies for people to search for hope with really simplistic solutions that make people feel better, or as a turning away from difficult and painful work, for example, to focus on a better future, perhaps as a way to escape a reality that is perceived of as unbearable. The second denial would be of the limits of the planet, the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption. So our notions of development and economics and transition and even justice inside the university, they continue to ignore this fact. A simple example that comes to mind is that if everyone actually on the planet lived a middle-class lifestyle, which of course is the goal of many justice and equity efforts, actually the planet would not survive, right? It's just not sustainable. The third denial is of our entanglement, like our insistence in seeing ourselves as separate from each other and from the land rather than entangled within a living metabolism that is biointelligent. And the fourth is the denial of our shared complicity in harm, right? The fact that our comforts and our securities and our enjoyments are subsidized by expropriation and exploitation somewhere else. So, for instance, well, we can think about all of the extraction required for us to be able to meet together right now on this call, right? So we're all involved in this. The university reproduces curriculum that sustains these four denials. And so it's actually from within these conditions of ecological unraveling and institutional repetition and and young people caring more than they have language for that I began searching not for solutions, but for some kind of guidance. So I wasn't looking for a new program or a method that would fix what is breaking, but I was interested in perhaps a way of learning that could interrupt the habit of reproducing the same worlds, even as those worlds are actually failing. So here in Mi'kma'ki, we were invited into such a possibility through the generosity of Elder Albert Marshall and his late wife, Dr. Medina Marshall. And they shared with us the teaching of two-eyed seeing. Um, Two-eyed seeing was offered as an ethical, and I think the best way to describe it is that it's a relational orientation. So an invitation to learn to see the world through multiple knowledge systems without collapsing them into one another and without positioning them in competition or hierarchy. So what it's asking is for us to learn from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western knowledges, and crucially, to learn to use both eyes together for the benefit of all our relations. Um, Elder Marshall has explained that two-eyed seeing is grounded in fundamentally a responsibility to all our relations, because he says it's a way we can use all our understandings to leave the world a better place and not compromise the opportunities for our youth through our own inaction. Since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, which that was in 2015, more and more people in universities have taken up the concept of two-eyed seeing in their work, and I think this is really promising. However, it's clear that there is ongoing uncertainty about how to do two-eyed seeing. And sometimes this has resulted in inconsistent practices among researchers on how it's interpreted and applied. So I want to say at the front end that I'm not immune to confusion when it comes to learning about worldviews that are not my own. And I suspect that Elder Marshall knows this, and in his gentle wisdom, has many times over offered medicines um, toward helping us toward along the pathway toward two-eyed seeing. And so prior to our course and throughout, Elder Marshall offered us a medicine, and it goes like this. He said, "Say what was said, not what you hear." So
Mm.
I'm just going to repeat that for a moment. Say what was said, not what you hear. So it took me a while to sit with this. And the place I'm at this moment is that I believe that Elder Marshall was offering a pedagogic mirror, one that reflected back the often invisible interpretive processes that we bring to attempts to understand two-eyed seeing. So say what was said, not what you hear, calls my attention to the way that I am interpreting and translating and subtly reshaping the teaching through familiar Western habits that I carry of sense making. Um, Elder Marshall's teaching, in my current understanding of it, was seeking to have me and my students noticed that we were doing things to the concept and twisting it into something other than what it was meant to be. So this was very helpful as an intervention. But I started thinking, if we couldn't see ourselves doing this remaking of the concept, how would we do anything different? We needed some help, right? Some way to ground the mirror that Elder Marshall had gifted us into the rhythms of the course. So we found some help from a powerful practice called depth inquiry, which is an Indigenous informed pedagogical orientation that I've encountered through the work of the Gesturing Toward Decolonial Futures Collective, which, by the way, is there's a real hub of people from the collective out on the West Coast. So if you're interested, please Google them. They've got all sorts of resources online. So from their work, we have adopted depth inquiry as a way of working at the level of helping us notice our habits, right? Rendering visible our modern reflexes, not just intellectual, but also emotional and relational, that quietly shape how we listen and interpret and respond. So through depth inquiry, students in the course were invited to notice how they were making meaning before deciding what something means. And I'm going to describe more fully shortly how this unfolded, right? How we noticed our patterned inheritances of modern education and socialization. Um, so doing this work in a university classroom is a bit unfamiliar because it asks us to inhabit our bodies and to feel our emotions and to acknowledge our responsibility and our complicity in the extractive systems that have caused harm. So as the denials are gently surfaced, they often appear as defensiveness and innocence, sometimes as solutionism. Depth inquiry is not about correcting these responses. It's actually about building capacity to stay present with those feelings of discomfort, perhaps sitting with the contradictions that arise, sitting with the complicity, at least long enough for something else to come through. So in this way, depth inquiry becomes a practical companion, a medicine toward two-eyed seeing, right? So it helps us pause the reflex to translate indigenous teachings into things that are familiar to us, into familiar Western frames. So this allows us to create space to say what was said, not what we want to hear. Maybe I'll talk just for a moment about what did this practice actually look like on the ground. Our learning unfolded through forest walks, encounters with more than human intelligences, mindfulness practices. We participated in sharing circles. We prepared and ate meals together. We celebrated the birthdays of two of the elders. We sang together. We journaled, um, all of which was woven with depth inquiries to remind us of ourselves. So I've got a couple of examples to share of the inquiries that we practiced with more than human intelligences. So I'm going to start with Juno, who is a young dog who spent her first 6 months of life confined and neglected. And she entered into our forest classroom as a teacher. So in the depth inquiry, she invited us to see her body as an archive of harm that she was present with us, right? And so she was refusing abstraction. She was right there. So students were asked to recognize the earth in miniature in her, wounded by human entitlement and violence, and yet there she was, still willing to offer relation. So we walked with Juno through the forest and occasionally stopped to ask ourselves reflective questions. Questions like, um, knowing what we do about her past, what kind of relationship do we feel pulled toward with her? Is there denial? Is there purity? Is there guilt or anger or perhaps even fear? Maybe even disinterest. So our Juno inquiry allowed us to step into the frameworks of harm through which much too often, I think, people rush to kind of correct responses like empathy and caring. And maybe we could even think about like allyship without noticing the emotional economy that they're actually in. So in this way, we were holding up a mirror to ourselves and pausing to name our reflexive pull and perhaps maybe even to interrupt that cycle. So it was an inquiry that helped us see that harm isn't just out there in what happened to her. It actually lives in here in the ways that we might orient to pain and vulnerability, which in this world is everywhere, right? So we were able to ask ourselves, how do we see the earth in Juno's body and story? So in this way, the Juno inquiry wasn't just about repairing a human-animal relationship, but also learning the muscle memory of a kind of non-coercive, mature, and accountable presence in structures of harm. So it was about holding the discomfort that we are participants in those structures that harm. But we too also have our own histories of being harmed. And actually, those histories are quite entangled. So Juno wasn't only a teacher of what was done to her, but also of the possibility of relationality across harm. Um, this practice wasn't just about inviting students to exercise their cognitive intelligence, but also things that we don't do in the university, like thinking about their emotional intelligence, their relational intelligence. So students were learning to think and feel and relate in conditions of complexity and contradiction. Um, maybe, um, maybe Maggie, do we have time for one more example, do you think? Or what do you think?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe I'll just offer one more depth inquiry example, and it involves a different kind of more than human intelligence, one that we lovingly came to call ugly rock. Um, So at one of our gatherings held under some really gorgeous, actually quite majestic cottonwoods, one of us reached into her pocket and pulled out a rock, and it was this kind of jagged, unevenly colored rock with mud wedged into its crevices. And anyway, she was cradling it in her hand, and she explained that the rock had a story to tell. And she'd been walking earlier in the day along a path, and she was cutting through a forest and had been thinking about the course and the fact that we were discussing and trying to connect with more than human intelligences. And she decided she was going to bring a rock to class. And she had decided that this rock was going to be probably something smooth and pleasing and perhaps, I don't know, comforting in its symmetry. And she was walking along with her eyes fixed on the forest floor, and many rocks were appearing before her. But as she was walking, she was dismissing them because they were misshapen and fractured, and she didn't think they were very appealing at all. And she actually spent a full 40 minutes looking around for what I will call beautiful rock. And she even pushed her way off the path into the forest because surely beautiful rock would be waiting there for her. But nope, beautiful rock was not hidden in the trees. So she stood with empty hands and she felt a lot of disappointment. She had walked the entire pathway and still no sign of beautiful rock. So she was feeling quite frustrated. And then um, the way she explained the story, something in the relational field kind of shifted. And she saw in that instant a mirror, right? She noticed herself because we'd been practicing these depth inquiries in the classroom. She saw her desire, she saw her expectations, she saw her entitlement, her orientation toward the more than human world. And she recognized that she had entered the forest path as um, like a consumer, right? She was seeking to obtain some object that would comfort her and meet her aesthetic satisfaction. And she says, in that moment, she saw how her search was shaped by Western habits that quietly ranked life according to usefulness and beauty and familiarity and coherence. And they were all centered around her wants and desires. So she was in this moment of frustration. She awakened to herself. So what she did was she knelt beside the rock that was nearest to where she was standing, and she quietly introduced herself, and she apologized for her behavior and asked if the rock would accompany her back to meet the class. And actually, Ugly Rock did join the class and became a mirror for all of us, um, like a teacher reflecting back all of these modern assumptions and desires that we all hold for comfort and accumulation. And in doing so, Ugly Rock allowed us an opening for another way of understanding to arise. So what we took away from that, we noticed that this kind of learning requires something that Western education rarely asks of us, the ability to notice ourselves while we're making meaning. So in the brief moment when noticing our habits and impulses became possible, another way of knowing was able to surface.
Mhm.
And in fact, what we learned was that a Mi'kmaq teaching shared in the course oriented us to rocks as grandfathers, right? These ancient beings who have witnessed the unfolding of time and carry wisdom without judgment and who communicate beyond words. So the encounter with Ugly Rock as a living presence rather than this inert object that we had been trained to see it as required a temporary suspension of our subject object relations that get normalized by Western education and worldviews. And it called for a self witnessing to notice how the lens that we use to see actually was forged out of human exceptionalism and separability between humans and the land. So the story that was shared allowed us to see that this is the same lens actually that reproduces the structural violence and the extraction and the domination fueling the polycrisis, right? So the encounter with Ugly Rock brought us into a kind of collective disruption that offered us ways of knowing that are relational, that are effective, and actually that are accountable to even more than human worlds. Um, and maybe what I'll just say very briefly is that our learning with Ugly Rock didn't arrive as some like insight or clarity, but actually showed up as kind of disorientation and a lot of discomfort. You might imagine how most university classes would respond if somebody presented a rock and declared it a teacher, right? So learning with Ugly Rock exposed all of us, me included, to a real risk of unintelligibility, right? A vulnerability to appearing naive or irrational or silly or academically unserious. And one of the students actually described her experience. She said something like, I feel like I'm getting dumber, but I'm more colorful. And so, what this comment points out, of course, is not that she was losing intelligence, but there was a loosening of the narrow forms of intelligence that are rewarded by modern education. So, beneath the fear of vulnerability, um, cultivated by systems organized around productivity and assessment and rigor, this place here, we invited something else. We invited relationality and humility and reconnection. Um, so I would like to perhaps, I don't have too much more time, I know, but maybe just to simply offer this in closing to say that there were a lot of cracks that were made visible by the pedagogic mirror that Elder Marshall offered us. Um, and through that mirror, we were all able to not just learn about Indigenous epistemologies and worldviews, we all experienced a shift in how we understood ourselves as knowers and how to locate ourselves within a living world. And over the duration of the course, actually, um, we all witnessed forms of a kind of devotional attention that I actually don't see in many university classrooms. Students put their phones down. They attended every week. They brought food to share. They told stories. They they wept. There was rage. There was confusion. There was joy. There were friendships that were formed. And we joked and we sang together. And there was a lot of connection that I don't have the honor to experience in a lot of the other classes that I am involved with. So what students were learning kind of slowly and often indirectly was that two-eyed seeing cannot be approached through mastery education, right? It's not a checklist, it's not a set of instructions, it's not a product or an outcome that somebody can claim to have achieved. It's emergent, and actually it's relational. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Pueblo elder Martin Prechtel, but he has this beautiful statement about two-eyed seeing, and he says, "You can't get it, you can't obtain it, you can't have it, you can't own it. It's got to be cultivated and left to its own devices to grow and become what it must be." And our participation in that is that we are going to recognize ourselves as the same sort of thing in that big field of different things that are growing. So for this reason, I haven't offered a definition of two-eyed seeing in this talk, but rather, of course, an account instead of a kind of unusual classroom experiment in which practicing toward two-eyed seeing really reshaped um, what we thought education itself was for. So many students describe shifts in how they experience their bodies, their relationships, their responsibilities to place. And these were not outcomes we planned or lessons that were delivered. They emerged in the space between us, between humans and elders, and more than human teachers. And we had no way of predicting this in advance. So two-eyed seeing isn't a destination. It's an indeterminate journey, I think, one that asks us to relinquish the which I began with, right? This Western desire to declare a kind of a rival. And it's not a practice led by intellect or mastery or certain, but actually um, love. Um, Before I pass this over, I want to just pause in gratitude and to honor the SPEC elders, Maggie Kaplan, who has been an absolute joy for me to connect with over this talk, and of course, Dr. Carol Christopher. Your care and your courage and your long devotion to land, Carol, has quietly made this course possible. So please accept my deepest appreciation. And I also want to offer my deep thanks to Elder Marshall and also Elder Prosper, who is another teacher to our course, and of course to the all the other wise ones who entered our learning space carrying gifts that could not have been summoned by me or substituted. So Diane Obed, Cynthia Sewell, Yvan Drouin. And I'm also grateful to my students because they showed up with a willingness to be changed and made this learning
Mm.
alive. Um, and finally, I want to just pause and if the land is listening, to say thank you to Mi'kma'ki, who was not a backdrop or a setting, but a living relationship with us, with our class. I want to say to the land, thank you for your patience in walking with us, even as we learn very slowly and imperfectly and without any guarantees. And in Mi'kmaq, I'll say, Amsit Nogama, all our relations. Thank you.